As an attempt to try to uncover, what are the origins of human culture? What is humanity? Um, I was looking at this 2017 anthology of anthropological studies, and I want to draw further insights from that text today. And I need to try and bring some context to be able to do that. So, what I'm going to do is ground this in some of the summaries of the previous episodes to try and draw from some of the insight that I already gathered. So, what I'm going to do first is read that. That will help me bring in the context of the rest of the series, and I'll go from there. So, from episode 2, we were talking about collective intelligence. I said, this is in the description, the core of human culture seems to involve the social capacity to renegotiate category boundaries. Under the empathic recognition of agency and the intention to share valuable information from the frontier of personal experience. So, by distributing our cognition and iteratively renegotiating our knowledge of the world, it's possible to transcend the dichotomizing and ossifying tendencies of the left hemisphere, which tends to trap us in a kind of runaway dynamic with tool making. Okay. So what I'm going to do is read the rest of the summaries. There's a couple more, and then I'm going to reduce them to a simplified construct, and then apply that construct to understand episode 6, and then press on. So that was about collective intelligence. Episode 3 was about remembering archetypal humanity, right? So the core of humanity, I said, is not just about collective intelligence and distributed cognition. It's also about how our social cognition rehumanizes our manipulative tendencies. Manipulative in both senses of the word. Specifically, it does that by allowing us to renegotiate our category boundaries, allowing us to periodically dissolve our identities, our structured ways of being in the world, and dissolving that kind of either-or thinking into a deeper recognition of shared being. So when the hand-eye coordination derived manipulation of the world through technical intelligence creates a kind of runaway arms race dynamic through unregulated proliferation of techne and fixated, like literalized or concretistic, one-dimensional storytelling, getting stuck in the same story. When that happens, it's back to the core of our human culture that we need to turn. Specifically, humans not only share knowledge socially, and we don't just reorganize our categories when the situation demands, we store our knowledge in categories that are of archetypal depth. And that implies that when the essence of our shared humanity is being put to the test, in the sense that we might get kicked off the planet, what that test is, that bottleneck, is that we're kind of being asked to mediate a renegotiation of boundaries between different archetypal forces, between different archetypal categories, thus healing an ancient and artificial left hemispheric derived division between humanity and the Earth. So that was a little bit sort of mythopoetic, if you like. Again, it's a summary of what was a much longer and more detailed and derived from pretty reasonable academic sources in the form of Roy Allen, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at University of Kent. What that distills down to is that the essence of humanity is about reweaving polarized opposites into a deeper sense of shared participation in life. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I'm just going to briefly finish this off. Episode 4 was about symbolic cognition and about how symbolic cognition allowed us to deeply embed ourselves with the natural world through story, through myth, through analogical reasoning that creates a reciprocal feedback dynamic between the social organization of our knowledge and the specificity of our individual experience in the world. That our individual experiences or episodes of life can be drawn up into this collective body of knowledge and wisdom, culture. Okay, and in the 5th episode, yeah, we focus on a bit more on the origins of tool use, a bit more on naming, language, and forecognition. Okay, but we then talked a little bit practically about how, like, essentially, if that's the case, like one way to, this is going to be an oversimplification, but those can be helpful in the right moments. And the oversimplification is this, and again, it's a symbolic portrayal of an experience, and the quote says, one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And this is basically a symbolic way of describing exactly the dynamic and the core of human culture that I was just pointing to. How do I say that in a different way? Again, I think the simple way of boiling it down is that we get stuck in the layer of duality. We're stuck in the duality layer, which I've represented as the two, right? From one becomes two. We see that that dualistic split cognition, that split way of thinking, originated long before humans, with such ancient categories as predator and prey, male and female, same species, different species, toxic and non-toxic, self and other. And that what humans really worked out how to do, is to inhabit this space, which is the space of two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. What do I mean by that? It's the space of accessing different perspectives. It's the space of participating in a shared understanding of the world. It's a space of dissolving any dualistic story, any black and white story that we've been telling about who we are and who we are in the world. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity to what makes humans humans, right? And it would be oversimplifying to reduce all of the summaries, for example, that I just talked about to a formula. But for me, it does help to have a simple symbol because it actually helps me to participate in my own understanding. It actually helps me to access the knowledge that I'm talking about. It helps me to get it. to embody it, to feel it. And that's kind of the whole point. It's like, and so if I draw on John to say that the origins of human culture are about accessing the layers of our being that are about perspectival knowing and participatory knowing, great. That's a little phrase that we can use, but it's just other language to talk about the same thing. But at least that's a way of getting us into a framework that can help us to understand not only what made humans human, but actually what we forgot, what we're missing. Because this prescription ends up becoming, how can we restore our access to humanity? How can we recover ourselves? How can we remember who we are? How can we participate more deeply? How can we, as part of a wisdom practice, seek out different perspectives and take them up rather than getting stuck in one particular story? And that grounds out in dialogical practice, imaginal practice, mindful practice, and embodied practice. This is the ecology of practices as a way to restore actually what humanity is supposed to be about. It's a way, I'm saying that that's a way that deeply involves participation in symbolic participation. And I'll unpack a bit more about what I mean by that in a minute. But this way of taking any polarity, any duality that is conceived. What do I mean by that duality? Well, it's a story. I mean that that's a story. It's a narrative identity. So what we tell ourselves is this is who I am, this is where I'm trying to get to, and this is how I'm going to do that. That's Peterson's model. It's a pretty good take on what's a story. We can see that it's also an agent arena relationship. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of assigning oneself an identity and assigning identities in the world so that one has a way of being that's like, these are the things that help me, these are the things that get in my way. It's a way of simplifying that narrative identity. But we saw that human culture has this way of rhythmically and periodically dissolving our stories. It does so both ongoingly and sort of yeah, periodically. What do I mean by that? I mean that this three and four, this problem of three and four, this space, which is between and beneath duality and has to do with the core of human culture. We worked out how to do this. We worked out how to participate in this depth of being. And we worked out how to do that in many different dimensions of life. We worked out how to do that in our language. We worked out how to do that in ritual. We worked out how to do that in our bodies. What I'm saying is that this space of deeper participation in life is a space of sacredness, and that humanity opened up to that space as it opened up to us. So one way to talk about that is the collective intelligence of the group, but it's not just about that. So I see what I'm trying to indicate there is that I see a certain pattern that I think is valid. I think it's helpful to simplify things in that way, although we want to be conscious when we're doing that. And so what I've been doing is then going into different dimensions of practice, like different directions of understanding. For example, trying to understand in language and trying to understand in ritual, how does this deeper phenomena, this perspectival and participatory depth of our being, how does it show up there? And so this is the framework that I've been trying to take in to ethnography. And by looking at ritual, by looking at the third chapter, which I did in episode 6, I was able to understand this how 4E cognition deeply binds us to the natural world, and how the collective intelligence of the group would it has these rhythmic cycles of, let's say, energy that periodically arise into celebration, into ritual. And when that happens, these stories that we take on, like imagine like I'm telling a story right now, right? Like so imagine that over the course of a month, you inhabit a certain role in the group and you do your thing and you go about in the world and it's like it's fine, but it's a bit you have to keep being in the same way and keep being in the same way and keep being in the same way. And every so often, there's a different time when we open to something deeper. And that something deeper isn't just about going to church, it's actually about reconstituting our identities. It's about dissolving who we've considered ourselves to be. And it's this layer of our being that is beneath the layer of duality, beneath the layer of our narrative identity. And it's getting access to that. And so by taking this understanding into an appreciation of ritual, I could understand how this, for example, we were talking about metaphorical cognition. We were talking about how one of the ways that this shows up in our mm, reorganizing our natural knowledge is that we can, for example, draw a similarity judgment. This thing is like this other thing that I know, so I can create a category. Well, that relies on this as if. It's as if this thing is that thing, because they're part of the same category, right? So that classifying, that putting things into categories, and then also periodically dissolving them, renegotiating where the different boundaries are. It's deeply connected to that analogical jump. And I think that analogical jump is one, like I want to start talking a little bit more about language here, right? That analogical jump is that as if we saw how that allowed, what am I trying to express here? I'm trying to express that We saw in ritual, for example, that when we use that metaphorical cognition, symbolic cognition, we could act as if one thing was another thing. We could do that in two different ways. When we have two different categories that are normally very much separated, we saw how in ritual, for example, they would suddenly go together. Very abstract, like I need an example of that. I mean, a very obvious example would be that, for example, that men and women in those groups often had extremely different roles during the normal, let's say, day to day. And there's a way that in ritual, the opposites, such as those social roles, sort of come together and all transform in more of a collective way rather than adherence to their strict roles. It's one example. So things that were separated coming into a kind of dissolved unity. But then the opposite is also the case and also derives from that metaphorical cognition. It's also that we take two things that are normally together and separate them periodically. Well, now that this is here, what I want to do is ground it more now. And so, like, I was taking that more general understanding and applying it in a certain direction, in the direction of ritual. How can we understand ritual in terms of the depths of our being and what that was affording for us? We saw that imaginal enactment was a key part of that. Pretending to be an animal allowed women to create a boundary when there normally wouldn't be one. Also allow this deep embedment with the natural world that was in one aspect of that. Yeah, this kind of practice is extremely culturally widespread. So now, instead of ritual, because it can get quite arcane very quickly, and it's hard to follow what the connecting thread is, and that's why I've spent so much time here. Maybe it was more confusing than clarifying, but to me, this simplifies things in a certain way that I'm returning again and again to. It's about taking any duality, any polarity, and yes, being able to inhabit that polarity because it's a lens through which we can see the world, but also periodically being able to dissolve that and get deeper. And that both ongoing and periodical access to those deeper layers of our being, that's what humans really worked out how to do. And it's also exactly what we've been cut off from and what we're trying to restore intentionally through dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practice, ecology of practices in community. Okay. So then the question would be, can I try to show that this is also showing up not only in ritual, but also in other places, in other spheres or aspects of social life, human life? So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to draw from a different chapter in the same text. There are many that are relevant. I'm going to draw from a part of a chapter today. It's going to be about language. So the chapter is chapter 6. It's called From Metaphor to Symbols and Grammar. So it's about this metaphorical cognition stuff. It's about that analogical as if leap. It's called the cumulative cultural evolution of language. It's by Andrew D.M. Smith and Stefan Hofler. And I'm going to briefly read who they are before I draw on their deep understanding. Andrew D.M. Smith is a lecturer in language studies in the School of Arts and Humanities in the University of Stirling. He received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Edinburgh. His main research interests are in evolutionary and cognitive linguistics, focusing in particular on grammaticalization, the inferential, sociocultural, and cognitive bases of communication, metaphor, cultural evolution, and word learning mechanisms. And he edited a recent book called New Directions in Grammaticalization Research. Stefan Hofler is a research fellow at the University of Zurich. He holds an MA in English linguistics and literature and computational linguistics from that same university, and a PhD in linguistics from the University of Edinburgh. A substantial part of his research has been concerned with exploring the role of pragmatic plasticity in the cultural evolution of language. Recently, he's focused on studying the connections between language and law, the linguistic conventions that have emerged in the legal domain, and the ways in which these conventions facilitate or obstruct comprehensibility. Bit ironic. All right. I'm not going to read the whole essay because it gets rather boring at the end, if I may say so. Or technical is another way to put that. But I'm going to read a couple of pages and try to pause to stop and talk about what we're reading while I'm doing that. So the introduction. Human language is unique among the communication systems that evolution has brought about in its use of symbols and complex grammatical structures. While some view human language as a specific biological adaptation, others consider it the product of more general cognitive and cultural processes. In either case, one needs to account for the transition from a pre-linguistic stage where humans or their ancestors did not possess language to a stage where language as we know it today has emerged. To this aim, researchers frequently postulate an intermediate stage during which a so-called proto-language was in place. There has been significant, at times vehement debate over both the nature of proto-language and how it developed into modern language, with opposing camps characterizing it as either containing word-like units, which were composed into sentences, or as containing sentence-like units, which were split into words. There's nevertheless broad agreement that proto-language was symbolic, but had no syntactic structures or grammatical machinery. This means that the evolution of language is almost always thought of in terms of two distinct aspects with different evolutionary origins. The emergence of symbolic communication into proto-language, and then the development of grammatical structure as the consequent emergence of language itself. Okay, pausing. I want to mention briefly that we already looked at how this way that humans have of, again, like dissolving different dichotomies, dissolving different polarities, renegotiating category boundaries, however you want to put that, it evolved before language did. We worked out this collective intelligence thing, this core of human culture, long before we learned how to talk in the way that we do in modern times. And so what we're doing is looking a bit more at what kinds of language were there before there were modern language. And to be specific, there's something that I'm trying to talk about that is hard to talk about that emerged into our language. There's something, this human thing that we worked out how to do. We worked out how to do that before we could speak, and then it showed up in our speaking. So by looking at language, and specifically by looking at proto-language, which was symbolic and specifically metaphorical. We're hoping to hone in on that. So, okay, continues. As Michael Tomasello puts it, quote, language is a complex outcome of human cognitive and social processes taking place in evolutionary, historical, and ontogenetic time. And different aspects of language, for example, symbols and grammar, may have involved different processes in different evolutionary times. In the present chapter, we challenge this conception. We suggest that there is, in fact, a common explanation for both aspects of language, i.e., that the emergence of symbolism and the emergence of grammatical structures are both products of the same cognitive and cultural mechanisms, and moreover, that these mechanisms have been at the foundation of all human communication, from its pre-linguistic beginnings to the present day. We argue that the capacity for figurative use, witnessed in the creation of novel metaphors, plays a crucial part in this process, which underpins a cultural origin for language from these fundamental cognitive properties. Okay, again, pausing. We can see how in this part of the paragraph, they're demonstrating what they're talking about as they're doing it, which I'm not doing very well today. What they're talking about is like taking these two competing theories and finding like there's a kind of it's a kind of hermeneutic it's a kind of Hegelian synthesis, but it's not exactly. The thing is that yes, you can propose another explanation, but this the machinery that they're talking about is beneath the layer of our storytelling. It's beneath the layer of proposition. And here they are talking about it in terms of language and of symbol and metaphor. But that's okay, we can understand them by analogy. We can understand what they're saying about the origins of language, but also analogize to something more general, I'm suggesting. And I'm suggesting that that can be revealing. Okay, so the main insight is that they're saying, what if symbolism and grammar emerge from the same underlying process? And that process crucially involves figurative use, creating novel metaphors, creating new metaphors. So what we're going to be focusing on is a discussion of innovation, particularly the innovation of new metaphors, and how that could either lead us astray or not, or be helpful. And there's also a clear connection to, for figurative use, like this is definitely tied to the imaginal, right, and to the symbolic. So let's unpack some of that. Just briefly, they're saying about the organization, quote, the chapter is organized as follows. We first introduce the ratchet model of cultural evolution, which explains how complex cultural artifacts can emerge as accumulations of innovations that are maintained through faithful social transmission. We then explain how the ostensive-inferential nature of linguistic communication, the ad hoc creation of metaphors, and their subsequent conventionalization can lead to just such an accumulation of innovations in language. Finally, we detail how the cognitive and cultural mechanisms underlying this phenomenon can account for the emergence of both symbols and grammar. And I'm basically looking at today, I'm looking at essentially the first third to half of their chapter. Okay, the first section is called the ratchet model of cultural evolution. And it says, although evidence of cultural traditions and social learning can be found in many animals, It's clear that human culture is unprecedented in terms of its flexibility, diversity, and complexity. These characteristics of human culture have been shown to arise as a result of cumulative cultural evolution, in which multiple incremental cultural innovations made by different people can accumulate over time and spread through a community. Tomasello, Kruger, and Ratner in 1993 famously described cumulative cultural evolution in terms of a ratchet effect, which is made possible by a combination of accurate social learning and innovative modification. Creative innovations are maintained within a population through their faithful transmission, and their cultural entrenchment provides a new platform for future innovations to build on, so that new learners are provided with a shortcut to the results obtained by their predecessors, rather than having to reinvent the wheel. Each application of this innovation entrenchment cycle serves to ratchet up the complexity of the cultural artifact, allowing the development of accumulated traditions which are far too complex to have been invented by a single individual. A ratchet model of cumulative cultural evolution relies on three crucial components, namely the artifact which evolves and the processes which make its cumulative cultural evolution possible. That is the transmission, social transmission, and innovation. Okay, pausing. So some of the key insights were that human culture seems to be unique if we consider other animals also to be cultured. And it's unique because of our capacity for cumulative cultural evolution. Like chimps can learn from other chimps, and crows can learn from other crows, but they don't pass that information on to their descendants, right? They don't accumulate knowledge over time. Like elephant society is pretty much the same as elephant society was really long time ago. So we can't really speak about them as having culture, even though they do have social learning. What I'm going to invoke already is that there ought to be a clear balance between innovation and maintenance. One might duck over to, I think it's episode 12 in the psychological type series, where I talk about how innovation, among other things, is this kind of the province of the left hemisphere in a certain way. They were always making something new, always making something new, always making something new, rather than invention, reinventio, being with what already is in a deeper way, discovering what already is in a deeper way. And so there's a way that innovation itself can get kind of out of hand in the left hemispheric sense. And I want to just mention that because the authors are not attuned to that. And so I want to suggest that what's unique about human culture is not only innovation, but also our ability to integrate. So there's something about innovation which is differentiating, right? It's something new, it's something different, it's creative, and that's really important, right? But we're also wanting to integrate that. We're wanting to bring those innovations back down to earth, or to work out how to fit them into a sustainable life. And I think we knew how to do that as well. They allude to that in terms of innovation and entrenchment, which has a dynamic of sort of progressive and conservative. And I think that's a bit of an anachronism. And entrenchment here considered can have this quality of appreciating what is. Like there's a way that if we're really talking about sustainable cultural life, there's a way that it's the same one generation after the other, right? And maintaining that sameness is really important. Innovation can be very dangerous. But anyway, here they're talking about a reciprocal feedback dynamic, um, a dynamical system of innovation and entrenchment. Quote, each application of this innovation entrenchment cycle serves to ratchet up the complexity of the cultural artifact. Yep, and so this kind of creates social complexity, which seems to be a kind of emergent property of collective intelligence. So it's the social learning of the group, but also their innovative modification of what they know. Okay, so now we go a little bit more into the different aspects of this process of cumulative cultural evolution. I mentioned the three. Namely, there's an artifact which evolves, and that might be a behavior, it might be a skill, it might be making a certain tool. It's a how, it's doing something in a certain way. I want to mention an um, one interpretation of this term, the artifact. No, I won't go into it. I'm going to say like the artifact is also kind of one way of talking about the collective intelligence of the group, but one can run that paradigm in the background if one wishes to. Anyway, let's consider artifact in a more standard way. The artifact which evolves. So this is the first part of their cumulative cultural evolution model, the ratchet model. It says, one, in a ratchet model of cultural evolution, artifacts are considered not just to be actual physical objects, such as axes, but rather the more general skills and behaviors which allow individuals to make and use them. An innovation to an artifact occurs when behaviors are modified. That's procedural, right? That's not semantic, that's procedural modification of behavior. And this is often characterized in terms of adaptation to the wider environment. Whenever an individual is confronted with a novel situation, a new situation, which is not congruent with their existing behaviors, they modify these behaviors in response. In principle, innovation of cultural artifacts is potentially ubiquitous because they are effectively always used in new contexts, which are at least minimally different from previous experiences. That doesn't help us very much other than to say that it's deeply procedural. It's deeply yes, embodied. It has to do with our 4E cognition, right? It's the innovation process is not merely semantic or linguistic. Now, we had these three components. That was the first of three, these artifacts which evolve, for example, our behavior or our language. Where the second was how we transmit that socially. So, two, transmission, of course, is the process through which an artifact is passed between individuals. This process is necessarily approximate because there's no direct link between different individuals' representations of the behavior, and transmission must be mediated by some kind of public expression of the behavior. This can clearly be seen in the case of language. So again, language is an example of something deeper that involves, I'm going to say, imitation. So there's a kind of creative exploratory behavior. This is again Peterson's model, creative exploratory behavior to engage with something new in a different way, and then we show that to the group, and then we imitate that, we copy, which is about embodying that pattern of behavior, right? This can clearly be seen in the case of language, which exists in two distinct guises. One, as persistent internal linguistic representation stored in an individual's mind, and two, as ephemeral external linguistic usage in communicative situations. So there's a kind of introverted and extroverted aspects of language. Language continually oscillates between these two manifestations, with each begetting and being begotten by the other. It's about creating and receiving. So one is listening and one is also speaking, right? Speakers use their internal linguistic representations to express utterances, And utterances are the raw data from which internal representations are abstracted through learning. Such oscillation between the private and public spheres is characteristic of the social transmission of cultural artifacts more generally. One individual uses their internal representation of the artifact to execute a public performance of it, a not very good one, and another individual uses their observations of the public performance to infer an internal representation. The third quality of their cumulative cultural evolution model, we did the artifact itself, we did transmission, and then there's innovation itself. So after we learn how to do something new, after we share that with each other, then what happens? 3, the oscillation model of cultural transmission, which is really just about sharing and receiving. Well, it's speaking and listening in one way. The oscillation model of cultural transmission provides two opportunities for the innovation required for the cultural evolution of language to take place. Either in the comprehension of a novel internal representation in the light of a given utterance, or in the production of a novel external utterance based on a given internal representation. Again, this is about receiving and giving. So someone might understand something new for themselves from what I said, let's say. Or I might say something new. Unlikely, but possible. I mean, that's the goal. So there's two different ways this innovation can take place. One in new creative use of language, that language can be used in a different way, but also that it can be heard or received in a different way. Okay. In comprehension-based approaches, innovation occurs through misinterpretation during the inference of meaning for an utterance, because there is a mismatch between the world knowledge of speaker and hearer. The meaning inferred by the hearer may differ slightly from that intended by the speaker. And so the utterance is associated with a novel meaning. It's been effectively reinterpreted by the hearer. Alternatively, in production-based approaches, on the other hand, language use is itself innovative. When producing an utterance, the speaker invites the hearer to interpret it creatively. The speaker invites the hearer to interpret it creatively, with a meaning which differs from its conventional meaning. In Hofler and Smith 2009, we have shown that both types of innovation rely on exactly the same underlying cognitive mechanisms, and each can be considered a special case of the other, but an account which places innovation in the production process and maintains fidelity in transmission comes closest to the general ratchet model. So yeah, they have an emphasis on their extroverted side, on creatively using language in a new way rather than misinterpretation. Should I spend time explaining that? I mean, to me, it's quite obvious what they meant. Do we come up with new uses of language by misinterpreting what someone meant all the time? Or do we actually use language in a new way? And it's like there's both happen, I think. So what they're suggesting is that metaphor, this analogical as if jump, analogical reasoning is central to the process of innovation and re-entrenchment in culture, to culture itself, essentially. So the rest of the section, which is about a page, it says, in addition to the many natural examples of cumulative culture in humans, not least in the incremental progress of science and technology. There is much evidence from from controlled experimental studies exploring the transmission of different kinds of behaviors and knowledge along chains or within groups of participants. For instance, um, a group of researchers used micro-societies, i.e. small groups of experimental participants, organized into transmission chains of overlapping generations to show the emergence of cumulative culture in tasks like constructing a tower from sticks and modeling clay, or building a paper aeroplane from a sheet of paper. They found not only measurable improvements in objective performance, for example, the height of the tower or the distance that the plane traveled over the generations, but also evidence of accumulated traits with designs within with designs within chains being rated more similar than those across chains. Okay. Experiments using artificial languages in similar microsocieties have also shown the emergence of linguistic structure under the interaction of competing pressures for both expressivity and learnability, and the emergence of regularity from unpredictable variation. Okay, that doesn't really help me so much, so I'm going to keep moving. Final paragraph here. Accumulated culture is common in humans, yet very rare or non-existent in other animals. Although social learning is relatively common in non-humans, and animals have been seen to create distinct local behavioral traditions, such as potato washing behavior in Japanese macaques. But there's little evidence that such innovations accumulate across generations, or that they amount to more than a single individual could invent for themselves. And that has led to much discussion over the cognitive mechanisms which are required for the emergence of cumulative culture, with the most important mechanism being high-fidelity transmission. With the most important mechanism being high-fidelity transmission. For instance, Lewis and Leyland have demonstrated using a mathematical model how the existence of the ratchet effect requires transmission fidelity above a certain threshold. I think I'm below that threshold today. In humans, high-fidelity transmission is itself underpinned by sociocognitive capabilities, such as imitative learning and active teaching, both of which are extremely rare in non-humans, and both of which require individuals to take the perspective of another person and recognize each other as intentional beings. This last capacity has also been identified as the key prerequisite for human ostensive-inferential communication, which leads us to the question of how the ratchet effect applies to that particular domain. Okay, just to briefly summarize that, cumulative cultural innovation, particularly in language, requires this high fidelity of transmission above a certain threshold, which depends upon pre-existing sociocognitive capabilities, such as imitative learning, active teaching, and perspective taking, which involves recognition of intention, and I might also add recognition of agency, trust, and a context of social learning. Okay, so this is really like into the nuts and bolts of how we create new words, right? And so now we're going to talk about ostension and inference. I'm going to go a couple more pages to try and draw out what I mean. There's clear indication here that this ratchet model of cultural evolution requires participatory and perspectival depths, right? It's not just about telling someone new words. It's about showing how, first of all, it's based in the procedures of our bodies, based in the behaviors that we use. Like when we encounter a new situation, we do something in a different way. And then how do we teach someone else that? Well, we show them. That's what extension means, right? We are able to show them socially like we're able to share that in such a way that someone else is able to pick up on it. They're able to imitate what we're doing. And that transmission is of a high fidelity over a certain threshold that requires this deeper perspective seeking and perspective taking, among other capabilities. I would say that participatory knowing is implied, and we're using again language as a kind of example or an instance. Um, yeah, so now we talk about the ratchet effect in linguistic communication. So we're honing in on language itself. We were talking about behavior, alluding to this again more general model of cultural evolution and maintenance. So, having introduced the general ratchet model of cumulative cultural evolution, we now investigate how this model applies in the particular case of language. First, exploring the workings of the linguistic artifact through ostension and inference. Then, we see how linguistic innovations emerge through metaphor and how they're socially transmitted and spread through a community by a process of conventionalization. So, I'm going to talk about ostension and inference. I'll do a bit about metaphorical innovation because it's probably important. I feel that it's important, and maybe about conventionalization because I also feel that's important. It then goes into the emergence of symbols, which I did not find to be as useful. So, ostension and inference. The function of language is communication, and it is in understanding how linguistic communication works that we can understand what is necessary for language to emerge. A common way to understand communication is in terms of the transfer of information from one individual's brain to another. In the absence of telepathy, of course, direct inter-brain transfer is not possible. So we use the intermediate step of a code in which the information to be communicated is translated into an associated signal that can actually be conveyed to the intended recipient and thence decoded back into the desired meaning. In order for this system to work, the interlocutors clearly need to share the same code in which every signal fully and unambiguously specifies a distinct meaning. So this is the language's code sharing model. Also, just to mention in passing, this idea that yeah, it said it is in understanding how linguistic communication works that we can understand what is necessary for language to emerge. The implication, although they did not mean this, but the implication for me would be that language is an unfinished project and language is yet to emerge. And it's by understanding how language works in this way, we could maybe get insight into how that process could be facilitated. Can language itself be midwife? Leaving that question now. Quote, from an evolutionary point of view, however, this so-called code model of communication is extremely problematic because a code cannot easily change while still remaining viable. Every innovation in a code needs to be matched by a corresponding innovation in everyone else's code and could only occur only extremely rarely at best. Even worse, codes are by definition made up of symbolic associations between forms and meanings, and cannot therefore help us to explain the evolution of symbolism itself. In the next section, we will show that rather than being a prerequisite for communication, symbolism is actually an emergent property of accumulated communicative interactions. Symbolism is actually an emergent property of accumulated communicative interactions. Fundamentally, though, the code model is unsatisfactory because communication is not simply a process of encoding and decoding, but rather depends profoundly on inviting and making inferences from context. So what they're talking about is there's something before symbolism. That symbols are emergent properties of repeated instances of communication. Okay? Human linguistic and non-linguistic communication is best characterized instead by the complementary processes of ostension and inference, respectively, the production and interpretation of evidence for the speaker's informative and communicative intentions. That's through Sperber and Wilson. In this ostensive inferential model of communication, the speaker considers not just which message to communicate, but how any signals they produce might help the hearer to retrieve the intended message. And I would say that this is exactly what I'm struggling with. Like, all I can do at the moment is share what seems important to me and not worry about how other people receive that, that's a real lacuna in what I'm trying to attempt at the moment because it's not, I'm so buried under all this material that all I can do at the moment is express and hope not to cause harm while I'm doing that. Um, I'm trying to be mindful of that, but yeah, some more um, attention to exactly like is it is it actually possible for anyone else to understand me? The observation being, no, probably not. I'm trying to boil it down, but it's difficult because can you tell? Can you tell that? Yeah. So in this ostensive inferential model of communication, the speaker considers not just which message to communicate, but how any signals they produce might help the hearer to retrieve the intended message. The cognitive requirements for this kind of communication are very different from working with a code. It operates through metapsychological reasoning about an interlocutor's thoughts and knowledge and recursive mind reading, as it's based on the notion of common ground. What's the common ground here? I think the answer would be embodiment. But it's based on the notion of the common ground, this considering what others will receive. So what is the it's based on this mutual knowledge that interlocutors assume that they share with each other, that there's some kind of a shared language. Much work has been done on trying to tease out the various aspects of common ground, but a number of widely recognized facets include the shared recognition of each other as potential communicative partners, recognition of each other's communicative intentions, and an understanding of the goal of the communicative episode. An understanding of what is relevant to the current interaction and knowledge of existing shared conventions, including linguistic knowledge. So the criticisms here would be um, like I'm trying to communicate something which is really difficult to communicate, right? And I can't expect a dialogue partner to follow me down all of these rabbit warrens because no one else has time for that. And that's a real lack because if I'm not in dialogue, then like I have to assume uh, a lot, right? But there's also the question of like, hey Sam, what are you trying to achieve here? What's the goal? And I mean, there is something specific that I'm trying to communicate, but it's really hard to communicate. And in fact, I think it might be impossible to define because it's exactly beneath definition. Um, there is a skill to it, and it's something that I'm trying to get better at. And laying this all out is one way to approach that. So Yeah, but so the requirements for this kind of common ground that we operate with are recognizing that someone can communicate, that they want to communicate, that they understand the goal of the communication, that they understand what's relevant, and that they know these existing shared conventions. So basically, what this is pointing to is that I'm presenting a whole lot of material that's not actually relevant. And you're right, a lot of this isn't relevant to other people, but I think it's deadly relevant. But this, like my recognition of what is relevant to others is perhaps biased. Um, and yeah, so understanding the goal, well, I'm trying to boil it down. I'm trying to distill it. I'm trying to get something across, and I don't know if there's a direct way to do that. Anyway, one way to frame this is this, like I'm approaching an understanding of relevance realization, and yeah, I'm trying to get more familiar with that. Last paragraph here in this section. Ostensive inferential communication is therefore achieved through two interdependent acts. The speaker carries out an ostensive act. The speaker carries out an ostensive act whose deliberate and atypical nature marks it out as potentially relevant, thereby expressing their communicative intention and inviting the hearer to construct an appropriate meaning. The hearer is prompted by the ostensive act to infer a relevant meaning for the ostensive act, using the context in which the act occurs and their shared common ground to do so. Importantly, and in contrast to the algorithmic mappings which underpin the code model, the inferential construction of meaning is an inherently approximate and uncertain process, which depends on the interlocutor's individual cognitive representations of the world and of their existing cultural conventions. Linguistic communication is therefore just a particular type of ostensive inferential communication, one whose immense power comes through the provision of expressive and precise cues, which guide the interpretation and construction of meaning. Yeah, I'd say that the goal is to give birth to language. The goal is to allow the, yeah, perspectival and participatory depths that are beneath dialogue to be felt and to get a feel for that, to get a vibe for that, to tune into that, to understand what that, not necessarily what that is, but how to evoke that. And that is something that can be transmitted. So this is already rather too long. I need to round it out by talking about the next section, which is metaphorical innovation. And to do that, I'm going to speak a little bit more quickly. And that means that it's going to be difficult. Metaphorical innovation. The linguistic artifact can therefore be considered as a set of conventional associations between form and meaning. Our next crucial step is to explain how an ostensive inferential communication system can support innovation. Although many computational models of language evolution use a process of random invention to produce new linguistic material, because their primary focus is the effect of imperfect cultural transmission on linguistic structure, random linguistic innovation is in fact extremely rare in actual language use. By contrast, the most productive and widespread type of linguistic innovation is metaphor, which is the key to ostensive inferential innovation. Metaphor is the creative use of an existing linguistic form to express a meaning similar to but not identical to its conventional literal meaning. If we think of this in terms of transfer, as the Greek etymology of the word suggests, metaphor means bridge, then the form might be considered to move from its conventional meaning to the new meaning, or from its source meaning to a target meaning. Traditionally, metaphor has thus been viewed as exaggerated, embellished, and exotic language, which can be contrasted with and distinguished from the lucidity, precision, and truth of literal everyday language. On this view, literal language, such as the sentence, John is greedy, expresses its meaning directly, while a comparable sentence, John is a pig, can express the same meaning metaphorically and can be translated into the true meaning due to the fact that greediness is one of the qualities we conventionally associate with pigs. Insights from cognitive linguistics focusing on actual language use, however, have pointed out a number of serious problems with this traditional view. Figurative language is not a rare and exotic deviation from the norm, but is remarkable chiefly for its ubiquity in everyday language. Much of our everyday way of talking about common events makes use of pervasive metaphors like motion and location to describe abstract entities, which cannot be located or move anywhere. For example, the unemployment figures are going down. The opposition is in a state of shock after their election defeat. Furthermore, there are countless examples where translations of metaphorical meanings into literal meaning does not happen, and indeed appears impossible. Abstract concepts like time cannot be represented except in terms of concepts, like space or motion. E.g., he has a great future in front of him. The summer is flying by. In fact, we systematically conceptualize fundamental experiential concepts, such as anger, in metaphorical terms. For instance, by representing it as hot fluid in a container, with the intensity of anger being expressed through metaphors. With the intensity of anger being expressed through metaphors. Of increasing pressure and the production of steam. For example, my anger kept building up inside me. I was fuming, and he was bursting with anger. Some generic conceptual metaphors, particularly those which derive from human physiology, like the representation of anger as a pressurized container, extremely widespread cross-linguistically, and perhaps even universal, while their elaboration into specific metaphors is dependent on the cultural context and physical environment in which the language is spoken. The creativity found in metaphors clearly poses a severe problem for the explanations of language which rely on the code model of communication, because using a form creatively is pointless in that it defeats the object of having a code. The certain result of the non-conventional use of a coded signal is communication failure, because the hero will inevitably decode the literal meaning. We can perhaps envisage metacommunicative additions. We can perhaps envisage metacommunicative additions to a code, such as emoticons, to signal to the hero that certain items are to be interpreted non-literally. But these only fix us in a catch-22 situation. They are no help unless they specify how the non-literal part of the message is to be decoded. And if they do specify how it is to be decoded, then they are not necessary. As metaphors are both constructed and interpreted through the drawing of analogies between source and target meanings. As metaphors are both constructed and interpreted through the drawing of analogies between source and target meanings. It is thus important to emphasize that interpreting signals as having non-literal meanings is only possible at all in a communication system in which meaning is not decoded, but inferred through the interpretation of evidence provided for that purpose, as discussed above. Meaning is not decoded, it's inferred. In order to infer an appropriate meaning for a metaphor, We need to focus on what is relevant in the communicative context. The metaphor John is a pig mentioned above does not necessarily have to be interpreted as John is greedy, but could mean he's messy, fat, rude, has behaved badly, or countless other possibilities, depending on the interlocutor's knowledge about John, and which of the characteristics conventionally associated with pigs are most relevant, and are therefore most likely to be alluded to. We can see, therefore, that metaphors routinely overspecify the meaning they are being used as cues for. Their successful interpretation requires the hero to disregard large parts of their conventional meaning due to their lack of relevance. Other parts of the meaning may not be represented by the form at all, but are inferred from shared common ground and context. So the form also underspecifies the inferred meaning. Indeed, in the ostensive-inferential communication generally, the cues provided by the speaker exhibit what has been dubbed pragmatic plasticity. They both under and overspecify their intended contextually relevant meanings at the same time. Final paragraph here in this section. The traditional sharp distinction between literal and metaphorical use can therefore be seen as fallacious, and the two are better conceptualized as a continuum. The two are better conceptualized as a continuum, with figurativeness being a matter of degree, and its extent corresponding to some measure of the difference between the form's conventional meaning and the meaning actually inferred in context. The greater this distance, the more strikingly figurative the usage appears. Metaphor is a basic universal cognitive process, both enabled by ostensive inferential communication and, in fact, an inexorable result of the inherent imprecision and indeterminacy of a communicative system based on the provision and interpretation of evidence, where a piece of evidence is inevitably interpreted differently by different people, with different memories, interests, and concerns in different contexts. Basically, what I got from this is, again, this is about taking distinctions, for example, between literal and metaphorical, and dissolving them. It's a continuum. All words, all languages, all language, all terms are more or less like a better or worse analogies. With figurativeness being a matter of degree. Okay, I'm gonna do one more. So conventionalization goes for one page, and then I'll stop because I feel that it deserves also to be invoked. It's not just about innovating new meaning. Because it can be about innovation, right? There's a certain way of using metaphor to evoke, to draw up certain non-literal ways of understanding, where literalism is connected with fundamentalism and black and white thinking, either-or thinking that's characteristic of the layer of duality in the left hemisphere. And so creative use of language can draw us into an understanding of the relevance of deeper layers of awareness, deeper layers of cognition, deeper layers of shared being, all of that. But it's not just about innovation, it's also about how do we maintain our access to that. They're still focused on language itself. So, conventionalization. Metaphor creation is an ephemeral, ad hoc process of innovation, but successful metaphors can be shared between interlocutors and ultimately throughout a whole community through a process of conventionalization, which is rooted in general learning. At its most general, learning describes a cognitive change that comes about through experience and memorization. through doing something or observing someone else doing something and remembering the event. When an individual is involved in a successful communicative event, for instance, they may remember that a particular form was successfully used to prompt for the inference of a particular meaning. Such memorization of communicative experience has two important consequences. Firstly, it strengthens the interlocutor's cognitive association between the form and the meaning. If the form-meaning association is repeatedly used in similar circumstances, memorization can lead to the entrenchment or habitualization of the association, which becomes a psychological unit in its own right. The more frequently the association is used, the more entrenched it becomes. Importantly, once the association has reached a certain level of entrenchment, the meaning can be inferred automatically, simply from the production of the form, without the need for the potentially complex inferential reasoning, which was required in the first place. And it can thus become independent of the context in which the association was first created. And it can thus become independent of the context in which the association was first created. I read that again because I felt that it was important. It said, importantly, once the association has reached a certain level of entrenchment, groundedness, or conventionalization, the meaning can be inferred automatically, simply from the production of the form, without the need for the potentially complex inferential reasoning which was required in the first place. And it can thus become independent of the context in which the association was first created. Secondly, the memorization of communicative experience establishes further common ground. It establishes further common ground knowledge between the interlocutors, which can be used in future communicative situations as part of the background knowledge against which new ostensive acts are interpreted. This not only allows the metaphor to be more easily interpreted in subsequent communicative episodes, but may eventually allow it to be invoked directly, independently of the context in which it was originally created, as a convention in its own right. A similar process can also be seen in a series of graphical communication experiments derived from the game Pictionary, in which participants must communicate concepts to their partners through drawings. Initially, the drawings must be contextually motivated in order to be communicatively successful. But over repeated use, they become part of the participants' common ground, and the relevant meanings can be identified simply from their shared history of use. Importantly, the drawings become more abstract. The drawings become more abstract and simplified over time to reflect this developing common ground. They need only resemble a previous drawing of the form rather than the concept itself. The two processes of entrenchment and common ground, the two processes of entrenchment and common ground creation therefore reinforce each other, resulting in the conventionalization of originally ad hoc form meaning associations. Conventionalization itself is a matter of degree, depending on both use and coverage within a community. A form meaning association becomes increasingly conventionalized as it's used more frequently in communication, and as it is encountered by more individuals who remember it. This observation is at the heart of cognitive and usage-based approaches to language, which argue that it is through conventionalization that linguistic structures emerge. Again, conventionalization itself is a matter of degree, depending on both use and coverage within a community. A form meaning association becomes increasingly conventionalized as it's used more frequently in communication. And as it's encountered by more individuals who remember it. This observation is at the heart of cognitive and usage-based approaches to language, which argue that it is through conventionalization that linguistic structures emerge. Through this process of innovation and conventionalization, language users are able to express meanings which were previously inexpressible. Existing associations are effectively used as stepping stones from which to reach new meanings through metaphor. And once conventionalized, these metaphors can serve as the basis for further innovation to open up further meanings. The repeated application of these processes of innovation and memorization is, of course, the ratchet effect we discussed earlier. And so we can see how the ostensive-inferential nature of communication allows the cumulative conventionalization of innovative metaphors, and thus enables the creation of an increasingly expressive and complex system of linguistic representation. So what I want to mention there is that it's not about the terms themselves. It's not about the specifics of the term, because we always get new terms being invented because these terms are used metaphorically, used analogically, and then they turn into conventionalized usages. They become accepted. And then they don't have the metaphorical analogical function that they first did. And that is a problem, actually, because they become literalized. They become conventionalized. And then we need new associations. And so that's why it's not just about inventing. It's not just about innovation of new terminology. It's about maintaining sustainable access to analogy itself, like analogy as a way, analogizing, metaphorical cognition itself, because of what it implies, because of what it points to. The metaphor would be something like all terms are fingers which point to the same moon. Yeah, and there seems to be a way that when our cognition has been sort of overly tied up in the creation of new terms, like the meaning that we derive is like very much in the story that we tell, right? Rather than in the way that our terms point down and kind of point everywhere, point to what is, rather than to where that story is going. I'm going to do a couple of paragraphs on the emergence of symbols because I feel that it rounds it out. But I'm going to finish with that rather than go into the rest of the essay. They go on to talk about grammar as well, and I didn't find it that interesting. Sorry, the emergence of symbols. The examples we've given in the previous section consider the conventionalization of metaphors in terms of a creative linguistic phenomenon. But in this section, we will show that the underlying cognitive and cultural processes of innovation and conventionalization actually predate language, and indeed underpin the emergence and complexification of symbols more generally. Symbols are usually differentiated from other signs through the arbitrary and habitual nature of the association between form and meaning. Arbitrariness, moreover, is often regarded as one of the most important arbitrariness, moreover, is often regarded as one of the most important design features of language. Icons, on the other hand, are signs where the relationship between form and meaning is motivated and based on some kind of perceptual similarity. Motivated icons can commonly be found in public places, like airports and tourist attractions, where they're used to represent passport control, food, bookshops, car rental services, and the like, precisely because language is unreliable, where there is likely to be a considerable proportion of people who do not have the shared common ground to understand the particular linguistic conventions of the country. Motivatedness, and conversely arbitrariness, are a matter of degree, however, rather than all or nothing measurements. And our account of the evolution of symbolic representations is one of gradual emergence. Our account of the evolution of symbolic representations is one of gradual emergence rather than sudden appearance. Symbols did not materialize from a void, but rather non-arbitrary, motivated, iconic associations first emerged. And these iconic associations then became arbitrary. Both these steps are made possible by ostensive inferential communication and the memorization of communicative experiences. And I think that will do. I don't think I'm going to try and summarize this. We were talking about really from one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one is the fourth, that layer of our cognition that is, let's say, more perspectival and participatory and less teleological, less black and white, less left hemispheric in the sense that McGilchrist means. And I'm trying to point to them. We were exploring ritual previously. This time I was exploring analogy and metaphor. And that makes it extremely difficult to follow. And I'll have to keep practicing. Okay.